Hello, everyone. Welcome to Writing Wise, and I'm Janet McHenry. And this session is going to be called Writing a Memoir. It's actually going to sort of help you jumpstart the beginning process of writing a memoir. So, first, let's talk about what a memoir is not. A memoir is not a journal writing. So, it probably won't work to simply take your journal and type it up and call that your memoir. It's not also a diary of events. A journal is more reflective in thought. A diary is a simple listing of things that have happened during your day, perhaps with some, ideas or reflections about that. So it's not that either. It's also not your entire life's story. And we call that autobiography, where you're starting more at the beginning of your life and you're working through all those events of your life up until your senior living years. And then it's primarily, I think it's most important to understand that it's not a rant. It's not a discussion of how about someone has used or abused you. So let's now talk about what a memoir is. A memoir is a collection of memories. It's more of a series of snapshots of your life. So those integral pieces of your life that are important to the telling of the story upon which you are focusing your book. It is a series of those moments that mattered. It's a character sketch as well. And sometimes people forget that. They want to make the story about someone else and their particular harm to them in some kind of way. But really, a memoir is a story about how you have overcome some kind of weakness or problem in your life. It's also it's a perception, of course, it's your perception of your experience. So you are telling your own story, through that particular lens of understanding about what you have gone through. So, with the other presentations for nonfiction books, I've been talking about objectives. An objective helps you kind of focus in and sort of narrow that sort of perspective about what's going to be in your book as you think about the outcome that you hope that readers have from that. So, you are going to help others with similar kinds of struggles. So, if your memoir is about the marriage struggles that you had and perhaps some, emotional abuse that you experience, your readers are going to be people largely who have experienced this something similar. So you're going to help them, get through their particular experience, because you have learned something from your experience, but also in the way that God has taught you through his word. um, you also want to keep in mind that another objective is to entertain the reader. So that means that we are using the same kinds of writing skills that novelists use. We are creating scenes, we're using dialogue, we're using those important fiction techniques that keep people riveted and want to keep turning the pages of the book. Another strong purpose that can exist with a memoir is the idea that we are educating someone about an issue, and be that sort of maybe mental anxiety, or maybe the book really is about overcoming childhood abuse, or maybe the memoir is about how to best live through a cancer journey of some kind. But in the process of that, we're using some information that really helps to educate someone about that particular subject. And then finally, we also see that another objective is to help define, who I am as a writer, who you are as the writer of your memoir. And it helps us also sort of to create meaning from that particular experience that we have had. There are different variations in terms of memoirs, and I brought some examples with me today. The first might be something that is really looks more autobiographical in nature. And an example I have of that is the book called Educated, and it's by Tara Westover. This is about her experience in a cult-like setting in the back hills of Idaho, a remote area where she and her siblings were not allowed by their parents to experience any kind of formal education. Not in the public school, but also not in a home school, not in an appropriate homeschool kind of setting. And then eventually, how when she finally is able to seek that education for herself, how transformational that becomes for her. It's a fascinating, it's a riveting book, and I highly recommend it. So, but what makes this more autobiographical, even though the subtitle says a memoir, is that she really starts in early childhood and she goes all the way up to the years when she wrote that, I believe, in her mid to later 20s. Another kind of memoir would be what we might call the traditional memoir. And a traditional memoir looks at a particular slice of life and what meaning that it has. It deals with the struggles that the character, the person, the writer has had in their lives. And some examples of that I brought um, are from our very own Athena Dean Holtz, and her memoir, Full Circle, explains the experience that she went through in terms of her getting under the control of a cult-like group of people who originally took over the publishing company Wine Press years ago that she was the publisher for. And so I definitely think that everybody who is involved with Redemption Press should read this riveting story. Subtitle is Coming Home to the Faithfulness of God. And it will give you a lot of insight into the history of this wonderful organization that you're part of that has been redeemed. And that's really all about Athena's life, is the idea of redemption. Another traditional memoir that I pulled up is Waiting for Snow in Havana by Carlos Erie. And this particular memoir is set in, starts out in pre Castro Cuba. And he's a boy at that time. And it takes you through, through his adolescent years, and shows how the influence of communism and the dictator Castro, how that affects everyday life for people in Cuba. And it eventually takes him and his brother to the U.S. Their parents release them so that they can experience freedom in a different setting. It's very, very well written, and it provides a lot of historical understanding. So earlier, when I talked about one purpose of memoir writing is to educate others about a particular issue, that really gave me a lot of understanding of how that change in Cuba affected people, in their everyday lives. Another traditional memoir that I pulled off my shelf is called Every Little Win. This is by Todd Tilghman. In 2020, that COVID year, he won The Voice. And he was that singer who won The Voice. And he and his wife are Christians. He's a pastor. And so it talks about the process of, winning for God's sake. And so it's a beautiful little memoir story there. Another one that I pulled off the shelves is one that I really loved. I read this last winter, All My Knotted Up Life by Beth Moore. And it really gives you a lot of insight into the abuse that she experienced as a child, and eventually, physical abuse of different kinds, but emotional abuse, but also the emotional abuse that she experienced as a woman who is a leader in the Christian community and even in the church. So it's really, really a good read. I laughed so much, particularly toward the beginning of this book, which was a surprise to me, given the particular kind of subject matter that's involved with the telling of that particular story. So then we can kind of then look at what would be called literary memoir. In that category, I have one on my shelf called Under a Desert Sky by Lynn Hartke. If it is your idea that you'd like to offer some beautiful writing, not just sort of tell a story, but offer some beautiful writing, offer different perspective, offer some biblical content along with the telling of your story, this is a really great model to follow. And this writer is from Arizona, so hence the title Under a Desert Sky. But her desert experience was cancer. And while I'd heard of this wonderful book for a really long time, I didn't pick it up because I thought, I'm not in cancer. It's not necessarily always in my family. I thought, but I'll read it because it's been recommended so much, and I can't tell you how many times I have now recommended this book because it is so beautiful. She weaves four, and what makes it literary in nature is that she weaves four different elements throughout the telling of her story: her cancer journey, her parents' cancer journey. Both of them developed cancer after she's had cancer. And so she travels across country while she's undergoing treatment to help minister to them. And so their journey. Then she also weaves in the Exodus story. So the title is Under a Desert Sky. And so the wanderings, of the people of Israel throughout the desert and Sinai, she weaves that in, really, I think, really significant, important biblical teaching in the book. And then the fourth element, which I thought was brilliant, was about her holy hikings in the desert. Like, she's a fanatic cross-country runner, hiker, both she and her husband, who, by the way, is mayor of Chandler, Arizona. So she weaves those in every single chapter. So every single chapter has those four elements, which takes some pressure off, because you can see how it's not necessarily all her story. It's about a bigger story, and that's what I kind of love about this book. If we can somehow weave in a bigger story and it becomes more about God and his work in our lives, I think that is definitely a brilliant approach to take. So each of those elements in every chapter all connect on some same thematic material for each chapter. They're not just sort of random ideas that are just floating there, but somehow, she's woven each of those four elements in a beautiful way. Then another method of telling a memoir is what's called a prescriptive memoir. And I think you see the word prescription in there, right? Okay, so a prescriptive memoir is kind of a combo between the traditional memoir and a Christian living book. Now, typically, in our memoir, we don't talk to the reader. We don't offer them a sort of teaching helps. But this new form of memoir, by the end of each chapter, you will find that there is kind of a stopping place, and then there's a switch to a teaching portion. It's still connected to the thematic material of that particular chapter, but it's not woven in all the way through, which I think that would be super awkward, because we love the idea of a narrative. But if this would be for someone who is looking for something like, okay, so what should I do with this? Okay, it's for that kind of reader. And you're going to find a few of these on the market. I have one here I'm going to show you in a sec. But another one I think is a really good example and can give you a methodology for that is by Kristen Anderson. It was actually written for her by Tricia Goyer. And Kristen Anderson was that young woman you may have read about in the newspaper, some years ago, who wanted to end her life, and so she lay down the railroad tracks so as to, to take her life. And she lost her legs in that, but she lived. And so she tells her story about that and about how she regains hope again in her life. And the title is escaping me. Forgive me for that. I'll come up with it pretty quick here. But the prescriptive element in her chapters is that at the end of the chapter, she writes what she calls a letter to my younger self. So she's been dealing with, as you're writing along and been dealing with a particular kind of a struggle in each of those chapters. And so then she's like stepping aside for a moment to speak to her younger self, to provide that kind of prescriptive teaching element there. So I think that would be a recommended one that you could use in terms of a way to handle that switch from the memoir kind of teaching into storytelling into something that's more Christian living ish. Okay. Another one, maybe it might be in that same sort of realm, is called The Rock, the Road, and the Rabbi. And it's written by Kathy Lee Gifford. And a Christian rabbi co-wrote this with her. It's about her journeys through Israel, the holy places in Israel, and kind of some personal takeaway. There's some, their observation of what is going on there, what they see, and then there's some teaching about what it means. And so with each chapter, the rabbi kind of steps aside and provides that kind of teaching element there. So I think we could probably put that in somewhere between a traditional memoir and a prescriptive kind of a memoir. Okay. I had this question come up recently. Are memoirs real? Are memoirs real? Okay, so we might be struggling as writers to go back and remember things that happened at age 6, right? I have a friend who experienced a tremendous amount of abuse. So how do we piece those scenes together if in fact we are to be creating various series of scenes just as a novelist would, and we're trying to come up with dialogue, we're trying to come up with even what did I wear then, that would be really hard, right? So what we're doing is we're just doing our best. That's kind of a line in my family. My cousin Carol said, just do your best. So it's our perception of events. There are chosen and constructed kinds of events and scenes there. They are to the best of my memory, with that sense of good motivation. Like, I'm not out to damage someone else's name. I'm not out to criticize the government for some kind of policy, but I'm simply trying to do my best as a Christian woman, as a Christ follower, to be able to tell my story the best way that I can. So, are they real? Yes, but we are definitely probably using some of that fictionalization, not necessarily with the intent to deceive, but with the best intent to try to inform. I think ahead of time, it will be really important for you to identify some core themes there. What is your story going to be about? Um, if it were an autobiography, it might not be as completely centered thematically. There might be some, there are going to be some running threads all the way through. But it's really important with the memoir to think of yourself as a character who has struggled, and to identify that internal issue with which you're struggling. What are you struggling with? Jealousy? Are you struggling with a faith that's fallen away? Are you struggling with lack of self-worth? What are you, as the character, the main character of your book, your narrative, what are you struggling with? And then you're going to, based on that idea, my book is going to be about that. Say, for example, that sense of self-worth. I don't feel that I am worthy. I don't feel I am good. I don't feel that I am deserving of my life. And then what I'll be doing then is doing my best to go back and think about those portions of my life that were pivotal in terms of either the developing the problem, developing that internal problem through through the manifestation of those external events, those external things that have happened to my life. But then also uh, those points of understanding. When were the turns? Where were how did the puzzle pieces come together? All focused on the development of that one internal issue. So we're going to find those pivotal places in our lives where either the problem is being developed, or I'm being challenged as an individual, and those pieces of understanding that lead to the climatic moment in my story. So that means that we're going back and we're trying to again establish and find those little bits and pieces of our lives. So there are some techniques that you can use to do that. You can create a timeline, brainstorming those events in a chronological kind of sense. That doesn't always necessarily mean that everything in your book has to have a chronological order. It may be that it's most important for you to start your book as like a 22-year-old woman. But you can do kind of flashback scenes to go into earlier experiences for that character's understanding of how are all the why pieces in your life. And then from that, you can build on the book structure and then develop an outline. I'm going to kind of help you with that now. So we're going to try to do our best to develop the book scene by scene. It will be a narrative. You're not talking to the reader. You're using all this beautiful showing language rather than telling kinds of language. You're going to use vivid details. You're going to use sensory experience. You're going to have the appeals to, not just what you see, but what you hear, what you smell, what you taste, all of those senses. You're going to create emotion in your book, and you're going to look for some certain patterns or recurring ideas to reinforce that core message. And if that's about identity, that means that I'm going back and I'm thinking about all of those particular kinds of experiences that I had into that created that false identity, perhaps false expectations, or those feelings of inferiority. When did those happen? I can immediately think of one of those. I can think of like, why did I never pass my swimming tests? If I was a good swimmer, why didn't I pass my life-saving, test 2 different times? Those are the ones I'm talking about. And then and then the only swimming race I was in, I got 3rd place, which sounds decent, but there were only 3 of us in the race. So I could take that, and that might be a piece of why Janet struggled with her identity, or a sense of self-worth. That's just one little example. So then you're going to refine and kind of edit your work. You're going to keep rereading your work as you go. You're revising for that strength of the message, and you're using again those showing rather than telling kind of strategies. Seek feedback from other people. People say, well, should I have my family read it? Yes. And if your family, in fact, is involved in your scenes, your publisher is gonna request that you get permissions if you're using their names, in the story, or there is that sense of reflection on them in some way, even if they're not named. So that will be an important element there. You want to polish, of course, your book for style, for grammar, and its overall impact as well, just as you would with any book. So here is how I would suggest that you begin a brainstorming kind of a process. Might want to take a picture of that slide. You might find that helpful. Perhaps, to buy a roll of butcher paper. I know Costco used to have it, And certainly you could go on Amazon and find one. Butcher paper, we used to use that kind of stuff to make signs for the sports teams in high school. Those long big banners, and the football players run through them and break them. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about butcher paper. So a big long roll, and to establish the kind of block it out in elements maybe a foot or so wide, and put a big line there and put 0 to 5 years. And then, or what do I put up there? 0 to 4 years. And then age 5 to 9, et cetera, et cetera, every 5 years of your life. And then just take time. Take time to think about, where you were living during that time. Okay. What did that house look like? Who were your parents? Where did you fall in the birth order? Who were your siblings? What were they like? What was important in your life at that time? What struggles did you have as a young person, then moving up well into, adult years? What are some happy, funny times? And that's, I think, what I mentioned, I appreciated so much about Beth Moore's memoir, was that there were really some significantly laugh out loud pieces in that book. And which is, I think that was really important for me, and that's a technique that Shakespeare even used. If every tragedy of Shakespeare's, you'll find there probably at least 2 humorous scenes. Because think about it, those people are sitting there for hours. Like if a full Shakespearean play were performed, it is several hours long, not just an hour and a half, 90-minute film. They're there for several hours. That might involve a break for a mealtime and all of that. But those lighter scenes that he introduced in the tragedy create that breathing space for the reader, the breathing space, because it's hard to read about those harsh things that other people have gone through. So definitely try to think not only what was good, what was hard, but what was funny, what was sad, what historic events were going on during that particular time period. And that will involve a little research, but that kind of research might also help trigger some responses that you had. Like, I can create a whole scene based on when I found out that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. I can relive that whole scene. That's what we're trying to do, trying to recreate those moments. Where were we? What were we wearing? Whom were we with? How old were we? At that time, I had just gotten glasses, and there was this connection with me that I was finally seeing life. There were some really tragic things that happened in those early 60s. I was seeing life. That was really hard. And up until then, it was a rather idyllic kind of experience as a child. So you can make those kinds of reflections and thoughts and jot all those things down in that piece on your butcher paper. Just, maybe you even want more room than that. What memories stick out? And then think about what perhaps were some pivotal moments. And again, you've got this thematic idea. So what are those particular pivotal moments in your own experience that would help develop that particular message? And then when you got that, and that's going to take a while, and certainly it could be done. You could do it on the computer, one page for these ages, one page for another set of ages, et cetera, et cetera. But you got all these notes, and I would, if you do it on a computer, then I would lay the whole thing out, page by page next to each other, and I would get a marker and go back and circle things. What's important to the telling of that story? Again, you're probably not going to start at age 3, when you first heard the words, why can't you do such and such? Again, if I'm building a thematic message on the idea of self-worth, that I'm not going to bring that in at the beginning of the book, but that could become a memory triggered by something else as I'm later in my adulthood processing all of this. Okay. So, as I mentioned earlier, we are using those really great kind of fiction techniques to develop the story. We're not telling people about things, but we are creating the story itself. And this is done through a series of scenes. You probably have noticed if you've read novels that any given chapter is probably going to have a couple different scenes. And a scene is, based on two elements of time and place. And so when a character shifts to a different place, it's a different scene. So those are some elements that we need to kind of keep in mind. But we also need to do a really good job at developing the character, not just you as the character, but the other important people in your story. You'll want to know, what were the kinds of things they wore, and perhaps what they wore is also a reflection of who they were or who they are. So think about, everybody kind of has their own style, and how does that style sort of reflect something about who that person actually is? Um, that you're going to use, you use these good characterization techniques where you're doing showing language. So you're having the character do some things that actually demonstrate their character traits. So instead of saying that Susie is messy, I have her do something that demonstrates her messiness, you know? So I'm using fewer adjectives to describe characters and actually put them in scenes that help develop that characterization. You can do that through what they say, and you can do that through what they're thinking, and you can do that through how others react to them. Okay. All of that is good showing language rather than telling kind of language. Again, we want to work on setting as well. And setting has basically those two elements, time and place. Other kinds of things that we need to consider would be the social condition of the time. What was happening historically? Or is there some sort of relevance to that? We see that definitely with Carlos Aries' memoir, um, Waiting for Snow in Havana. And the what was happening historically in Cuba is critical to the telling of that story. That might be true for you as well. Maybe something traumatic happened in the world. 9/11. Something like that. We can't ignore those kinds of things happening simply because we are immersed in our own little story, because those events in the world certainly affect us. COVID, that particular experience, major event that affected the entire world, not just our country. So we want to think about what's happening historically. What are the social conditions? What's the social climate like? How are people treated? What are the kinds of things that they say during that time? And be thinking about that. Your own dialogue. Has your own dialogue evolved over the years? My spoken dialogue probably has gotten worse because of teaching teenagers. And I find myself saying, "Oh, and she's like, it's like, kind of that Valley Girl speak." I found myself falling into that because I heard it all day long. So, those kinds of things you could think about in terms of the character and how the setting, the time period, the place can really influence the characters themselves. And setting can have an influence on character. Setting can help create conflict. Setting can help develop the thematic idea as well. So don't ignore setting. We got to always kind of work on our setting, and instead of saying that that it was hot and sticky, we want to use more sensory kinds of details to be able to develop those kinds of scenes in our book. You can do that through, again, those sensory details. I mentioned that here on the slide, but also images, using that beautiful figurative kind of language, comparative language. And I have to just kind of slow my brain down a little bit to sort of make that happen. But it is a really good challenge, and it can add something really special to your writing. I love the idea when we're developing setting to use a lot of details. So instead of saying that her room was neatly organized, which I can't visualize that. I mean, well, I can visualize it, but it would be with only within my framework. And the way I organize something, the way someone else organizes something might be completely different. But if I could show the books lined on her shelves from yellow to orange to red, yellow, from red to orange to yellow to green to blue, etc., like that, that says something about not only the setting, but it says it helps to develop the character as well. So notice those wonderful details in rooms. Know to think. So you're going to have to go back and think about, okay, furniture for time periods, those kinds of things. Think about climate. We lived in the East Coast, the Northeast. We lived in New York. That climate was drastically different, but we also lived in Phoenix, you know, very hot, very dry. We lived in Albuquerque, higher elevation there, etc. So those would be kinds of sensory kind of details that I want to bring in. All those mentions of the actual factual mentions of times and dates and places. We got to get names right if we're mentioning those details from history. We want to also develop well those kind of internal feelings and emotion and perceptions through beautiful kind of emotive kinds of language. Um, the literary point of view is perspective, and that's referred to often as POV, point of view. Memoir has one option. That option is first person. You're using the I voice, so it's I, my, me, mine, our, ours, that kind of perspective, and you stay in first person all the way through. The exception might be if you're going to use the technique of the prescriptive memoir, that when you shift to that teaching portion, and you're probably going to identify that clearly with some asterisks in the middle of your manuscript, so we know that there is a shift into something that's going to be more teaching oriented. Then you can use the more inclusive kinds of language. You can speak to the reader a little bit there and use you kinds of language, second person language. But you're going to stay only in the head of you, only in your head. You can't tell me what Sally was thinking. I can only know what Sally was thinking if she says it out loud, right? Or if she writes it in a letter to me, that kind of thing. So you can't tell the reader what someone else was thinking or what their motivation was. You have to be very careful in terms of point of view to only stay in your head and not try to represent what others' motivations or thinking or reasons were, rationales, unless they voice them in some kind of way. You can use those eyewitnesses, those other people, to report events to you that you did not experience. So this first person perspective means that you can't tell me what was going on, maybe in someone else's car unless you've been there. But you could have someone come to you and tell you about it. And so then you're creating that scene, like that excited scene, like you can't believe what so and so just told me, that kind of thing, or what just happened. Your plot should be in a chronological order. You can relate events prior to your birth, prior to the beginning of your story, but you would need to, do that in such a way that you're providing context, background for how you learned about them. So for example, one day someone says something unkind to you. So if my book is about self-worth and someone says something unkind to me, then maybe I can go back and remember, oh, but in sixth grade, that really nice boy gave me the largest Valentine, in his Valentine pack. There was always one large one, and how special I felt. and how I could use that to help process maybe what I was going through something later on in my life. So you can, that's called disrupting the narrative. You can disrupt that chronological order with those kind of flashbacks or those pieces of information that you receive to kind of lend understanding and context for the story. So I mentioned this, yep, some plot ideas. So how can we play with the plot a little bit because first person seems so limited? You can use those flashbacks. You can have a flash forward moment where you say something like, "Well, I would find 5 years late, 5 years later, I would learn that, my father had blah blah blah," that kind of thing. So that's called a flash forward. You could even use kind of in the structure something circular in nature. So maybe the beginning of your story, if your story is about self-worth in some kind of way, at the beginning of the story, someone has said something really unkind to you, and that's the big trigger for the movement of the plot to create that sense of struggle in the story. But maybe at the end of the story, that same person comes around and it's totally different. It's totally kind, and maybe it lends understanding and kind of a finishing point. I love stories that are kind of circular in nature like that. It feels like things are fixed. It feels like things are whole in some kind of a way. You can bring in other people's perspectives again through dialogue, through some kind of an interview, through phone conversations, text messages now, letters or something like that. Maybe you come upon your mother's letters to your father, and maybe those become pieces, from each of the chapter to help you understand who your parents were, if they were problematic in terms of your personal development. And then there's the idea of something that like Lynn Hartke did with Under a Desert Sky. You could divide the chapters into segments. There's your story, but then there's a side narrative of something else that's going on. Somehow, thematically, they're connected. Then maybe something of the biblical story. So if your story were about injustice, and probably someday I'll write that memoir. We have a story about injustice. Um, you know, I could write about Joseph and his particular experience. I think that's the perfect narrative, to bring in chapter by chapter a little bit there, to help kind of lend some understanding as to, the whys behind what we went through. Okay, so again, always kind of thinking of, as we're writing a memoir, we're telling a story, we're using that great showing language. So I'd love to challenge you to introduce figurative language into your writing. Maybe you have a favorite writer who does this so well. I have a couple. Cheryl Bostrom she wrote the book Sugar Beards that has won a million different awards. Just reading really good writers' work. Cynthia Rookti is another. And I what I do is I'm developing a scene, and I write nonfiction, but I'm still writing scenes here and there. I'll think, well, what would Cynthia say? Or I'll just tell myself, well, what is this like? What is this experience like? And so that lens that's set up for a comparison of two things that are unlike, except they have one shared quality of some kind. And that helps the readers understand and get a picture of what you're feeling, what you're experiencing. Also use that really rich descriptive kind of language. And I don't mean those kinds of adjectives that make our work easy. I don't mean using words like she was messy or she was very critical. Show me she's critical. Show me through dialogue, through things she says, things that she does that she's critical. So rather than don't use labels, but use specific details there, and that becomes really great kind of descriptive language, both for characters and who they are and what they look like, but also settings, rooms and places, the outdoors itself. Um, I live in the Sierra Valley, which is the largest alpine in North valley in North America, and it's a gorgeous place at 5,000 feet. And it provides lots of opportunity to think of comparisons. So, if I have some kind of a struggle, I look to the mountains, the hills, and like, okay, God, here's this mountain. I feel like I have a mountain in my life. How are we gonna climb this mountain? So I would probably bring that in some kind of a way. It becomes an image that is a symbolic kind of a methodology for developing the idea of struggle. Use strong emotional kinds of language that creates that sense of yearning. It creates the sense of pain, creates that sense of struggle, and eventually, victory in someone's life. Um, and then there's the idea of jargon. I hope you know what jargon means. Jargon is, if you think of it as more like business language, there is a very specific jargon. So if you have an attorney and you're dealing with legal matters, you need to know the words. You need to know the legal words. So, someone files a pleading, that's a legal word. Someone has a civil case or a criminal case, and know the difference between those. Journalists have jargon. And did you know that in the newspaper business, they don't have captions under photos? You call them cut lines. So that, it's just something that I learned being a journalist and working for a newspaper. So if you're going to have that teacher, what are the technical kinds of words that teacher would use if you're going to have scenes in a school? And I've seen so many errors from novelists who write about teachers, which is apparently is really common, but they don't necessarily understand the jargon, and they don't necessarily understand the procedures that teachers have to follow and that administrators have to follow. A bad example of that was a novel that I was reading, and right at the beginning, the principal in the school where the teacher is teaching has her personnel file on his desk. That would never happen. Pers- Individual personnel files are never in the school setting. They're always in the administration building. So just things like that to know your characters well. And if you're going to have one who's a barista, you're going to have to do some research about that to represent that person, what she's doing well. Colloquial language is super fun. That's the common everyday language, kind of slang that we use. That might be particular to time period, but also to region. Um, those expressions that are used in the South are going to be different than those that are used on the West Coast or the East Coast, and the way that they represent ideas. And then using formal language in the sense that it's well written and there's a variety of words, and that we're not using our same kind of pet words over and over again, but we are writing well. Okay. Rather than generally, we're writing specifically. So we're not using words like stuff and things. Maybe if someone says that in dialogue, yes, but not, uh, we don't say, I wasn't understanding that thing that she was talking about. Okay, I want to be more specific, using very specific kind of formal language there. Okay, tone and mood. So let's talk about that a little bit. Tone is the quality of the writer's voice that expresses the writer's feelings and attitudes, and that is expressed. The tone comes off the page because of the words that the writer is using, and the mood is more ephemeral than that. It's like the overall atmosphere of a text. Sad, it's uplifting, it's exhilarating or suspenseful. And we can create those emotional kinds of scenes in our book through that's very specific emotive kind of word choice, through sentence length. You'll notice that in film, when we're getting to the climatic or the dramatic scenes, that the scenes will become shorter, shorter, shorter. 1 second, 1 second, 1 second, 2 seconds, 1 second. Those scenes, boom, 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 like that. We can create that kind of mood in a story that, of our own that we're telling simply by using shorter sentences. So we shift from the more long and involved sentences to those shorter sentences that will create that sort of tension and suspense in a story. Different kind of stylistic elements, the choice of words and so forth, and then the beautiful use of imagery, that sense of comparison, creates a beautiful manuscript as well. Okay, so we know our story, right? People out there do not. So that requires a slowing down, and providing all the context, all the kind of the historical details that the reader is going to need to understand what that character is going through. What's happening historically, if that's definitely affecting the what the character, you as the main character in your story, is experiencing. There's some cultural context in terms of where you are. Where are what is your experience? Is your experience as a Mexican American young woman, living in the South, or maybe we take her and we put her in Chicago, those kinds of the culture sort of clashes and challenges that happen. We have to kind of help the reader with that. Okay. So, what I really advise the writers do, is to read a variety of memoirs to kind of discover the kind of style that you'd like to write. There are different ways, and I think, as I always kind of preach, to study the form, find those really great mentor books, find those ones that can help you understand how to pace your work, how to create scenes, how long should scenes be, how often does a writer introduce dialogue, how does a writer actually move characters from place to place. This is a weakness I often see, for those who are trying to write a narrative from the get-go, is you haven't moved my character to the new place, and I don't know where we are in terms of time or place, and what is this new setting, what time of day is it, all those good pieces. So what we can do is, as we're reading those really good works, is, to circle things, just take mental note of how the writer kind of plotted that out. So I'm going to look over here on the comments to see if there are any kinds of questions here. Kathy is saying hello, and hello to everyone else. And Anne is here. And Kathy says, my book is a prescriptive book of memoirs. I didn't know there were more than one kind. So, yeah, you're writing. So you're writing a memoir and you're using that prescriptive kind of technique. I highly advise that you hold on to that prescriptive portion until the end of your chapter. Don't try to introduce it in the middle of scenes. Don't try to break from that, from one scene, and then have a teaching portion and then try to introduce another scene. It's going to be too awkward for the reader to make that kind of transition from that zigzag, but to offer that prescriptive portion at the end of your chapter with a consistent methodology so that the reader can kind of expect what's going to happen there. Okay, so she said she divided hers into 3 sections: courage, family, nature. Have not been trained. Can you list the books you told about? Yeah, I can put the list of the books that I mentioned. I'll put that on the page for Book Marketing Pro Academy, and you can find those there, that, rather than my trying to write it into comments right now. So are there any other questions that anyone else has? All righty. Okay. Kathy says that's what okay, her book is in print, and that's what she did for each of those stories. Well done, Kathy. Good job. You are welcome, Anne, and all the rest of you. It's good to see you popping on here. And again, as you're, experiencing some new ahas, some new learning points here, shout out Book Marketing Pro Academy to your other writer friends so that they can learn along with you. You'll feel like you can challenge one another. You have something to talk about in your writer groups or in your critiques and so forth. And I think that will be a benefit to the larger group. And you are welcome as well, Carol. Thanks for being here. And I'll look forward to talking with you in a couple weeks. And we are going to address how to get those podcasts and then what to do in an interview and what to do afterwards. Thank you.